Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum Podcast is sponsored by Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. $38 a month. Sponsor a child in Jesus' name. Every child being discipled in the Word of God, providing hope, providing food, providing education. This is what Compassion does. And you can be a part of it. You can be the change in a child's life, providing hope through compassion. $38 a month. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum and sponsor a child today. I promise you, you will not regret it. Today's guest on the podcast, former NFL tight end, Super Bowl 41 champion Ben Utecht is our guest. He was a 4-year starter at the University of Minnesota, grew up in Hastings, Minnesota, and Ben then moved on to the NFL where he wasn't drafted. And in this podcast, he tells the story of how Tony Dungy, the former Colts coach, the Hall of Famer, the man of faith, came, sought out, and made a promise to Ben, and then eventually brought Ben to the Indianapolis Colts, where he was a part of that team for 4 seasons. He won a Super Bowl there, Super Bowl 41 back in 2006, catching passes from guys like Peyton Manning, and certainly leading his team and helping to lead his team to a Super Bowl victory. He also talks about the unique way that Tony Dungy incorporated faith into the Super Bowl ring that Ben got and all the other members of the Colts got, which is kind of cool. So definitely be listening for that. But Ben's career started to take a turn for the worse, unfortunately, as he suffered 5 documented concussions in his NFL career. His 4th being the first one that he ever experienced amnesia with, where he couldn't remember anything that he saw, anything that happened. When he was shown the video the next day, he tells this story on the podcast, he didn't remember being hit. He didn't remember anything about the concussion. And unfortunately, that last concussion, which took place on Hard Knocks, if you remember, when he was a member of the Bengals, led to him having to make the difficult decision to retire from the game. And he then became an author, a speaker, and a musician, and also an entrepreneur. But there was a time when Ben, with the brain injuries and with the concussions, thought that he might not be able to, or that he might get to a point where he would not be able to remember anything in his life, like including his family. So he wrote a song in 2014 called "You'll Always Be My Girls." And if you watch the video, it's excruciating because it shows him in a light where he literally thought that there was going to be a moment where he would lose all memory because of the concussions. He then wrote a book in 2016 called "Counting the Days Until My Mind Slips Away." Again, that title is just excruciating to read, but there's a happy ending in this. Ben's mind and how he's doing is really nothing short of a miracle. He's doing great. His mind is sharp. But he still has these concussions and the brain injuries, and that is something that will live with him. But he's doing well, and we're grateful that he joined us here on the podcast. He has a new album out called "Standing Strong," which was released earlier this year in 2018. He's a musician. He's got a new consulting business he's starting with Keystone Culture Group. I mean, just a lot going on, and his story is a powerful one. So let's get right to it. Without further ado, here he is, former NFL tight end, Super Bowl 41 champion, Ben Utecht, joins us here on the Sports Spectrum Podcast. 2018 marks 9 years since you last played in the NFL. What has transition been like from the NFL? I know that, again, there's a lot of layers to this, but just take us through where you are today and how you're doing.
Well, obviously it wasn't an easy transition, just having to leave the game in many ways due to an injury, so it didn't feel like it was necessarily my choice. But at the same time, it was the right choice, especially with its connection to concussion and traumatic brain injury and just wanting to ensure the long-term health of my brain for myself and for my family. So it was the right choice. And it was interesting because I had always had equal passions for speaking, for singing, and those were the areas I was going to go into. So, I think one thing that really helped me with the transition was, first and foremost, faith, that I had a foundation, a belief system I could practice that would ground me during that time. But then, I knew where I wanted to take my first step, and so we moved down to Nashville and really gave the music an opportunity, and I think also, that's where I think the foundation of speaking also really began. And so, the challenge is you've been at the top for such a long time in sports, and you genuinely think that level is just going to maintain when you step into the real world. And I think you're hit with a pretty rude awakening that the real world is not the football field. And so redefining yourself can be challenging, and it really was for me. And so really the last 6 years has been a process of surrender and prayer and seeking purpose, finding significance again, and really kind of allowing life's circumstances to kind of be the fingerprints of God and direct you in finding those things. And so music has always been a part of my life, and it still is today. And we've got some fun things going on there on the side. And the Lord, I think, has really used my voice in speaking, particularly in leadership and building high-performing culture, especially using that Super Bowl 41 blueprint created by guys like Tony Dungy, Peyton Manning, that I was blessed to experience. So there's a lot of purpose in what's happening now.
Ben, why do you think players, I should say, from the NFL struggle with transition when they retire, the transitioning to the real world? I know obviously injuries, you have to, work through those as well. And yours, as we'll get into, was a different deal and a different dynamic, but just being acclimated back into regular society. Why is that so difficult for so many football players and so many athletes?
Well, obviously, I can only speak to my own personal, perspective on that, but I believe that a lot of it has to do with, with really unknown identity. Who are you, and what do you believe, and how does it affect the way that you live your life? And I think when you make it to a professional level, you can really now attach your career all the way back to when you started playing that sport competitively, which puts a lot of NFL players who end up playing more than the average career length, of 3 years, into a category where this sport has been their identity for 20 to 25 plus years, and then in one moment, it's over. Mm-hmm. And it really does. It really does feel like that. I mean, the Tom Brady's and the Peyton Mannings, the guys who, when their career ends, it's glorious, and they keep getting brought back into the NFL, and statues are made, and that is far from the typical. I played 6 years, and when the Bengals decided to let me go, it was done. It was a phone call. It was a clean out your locker and walk away. I mean, it was very fast. It was very quick. And so in a moment, in a blink of an eye, that 20, 25 years stops. And there's no real preparation for that. So now you have to walk out into the real world and re-identify yourself. And I think that really is a lot of, has a lot to do with why these young men struggle making that transition.
Yeah, I think identity it's sort of a buzzword that is used a lot, especially in the faith circles, but I think it's a real struggle. And I think it's not just for athletes. I think identity is a struggle for so many just in the world, being identified by their job or by identified by, what they do for a living or how they are, as opposed to whose they are. in Christ. So that's
Exactly.
that's it, man.
Exactly.
Let's go back. I want to take us back and hear a little bit more about your journey growing up. I know in Hastings, Minnesota was the hometown and sports. Where was sports in your life? And certainly faith, your dad, a Methodist minister. Take us through growing up in Hastings, Minnesota.
Well, growing up in Hastings was, I think, the platform that needed to be there in order for me to really have any success in sports. It was a thriving sports community, and I was a 3-sport athlete. I was in track. I was a hockey player, believe it or not. I was a goalie. You grew up in Minnesota, and the state sport is hockey. So
I know you have to play hockey if you're from Minnesota.
Got to play hockey. Got to play hockey. And then football. And my senior year, for a small river town in Minnesota, we had five guys go Division I full scholarships to the University of Minnesota. 1 for basketball, 3 for hockey, and myself for football. So it was just an amazing environment, athletic environment to grow up in. And, I have somewhat of an interesting story because, recruiting was totally different back then, James. It's not like today where you have the hub website, I think it's called, where, every single video of every player is all consolidated, and, scouts can basically make sure they see every single young talent in the country. It wasn't like that. So my dad and my uncle, we made all the videos. We did all of our own recruiting. We ran the ball a lot, as an option team. And I was a 6'5", 210-pound, receiver who maybe got 15 passes a year because we were an option team. But I was fast, 4.40, and for a tall guy, it was, so we had to do it all on our own. And one of the camps that I got invited to was the University of Minnesota. And I just, lights out. I had a great summer camp. It was the June after my junior year, and I was young, so I was still 16 years old when I went to this camp. And ran a 4.40, caught everything. And at the end of the camp, Glenn Mason called me in his office and offered me a scholarship at 16 years old. So I was with my dad, and it was just kind of a dream come true. So reached over the table, shook his hand, and was the first to commit, and that was really, I think, what set the tone. And so that was 4 years as a starting tight end in Minnesota. I had some pretty serious injuries, but the Lord orchestrated my journey to Indianapolis with Tony Dungy, who is also a University of Minnesota alumni.
Yes.
He kind of created his own miracle story of bringing me to the NFL through those injuries and through a promise Tony Dungy made to me in front of a large group of alumni that if I slipped through the cracks and didn't get drafted, he'd be the first person to call. And sure enough, due to a very serious abdominal injury, I didn't get drafted. I went from being a potential first-round pick to not getting drafted. And in the free agent market, the first person to call was Tony Dungy, and brought me to Indianapolis, provided surgery, gave me a whole year to recover. He and general manager Bill Polian, both in the Hall of Fame now, said, we don't even want you to think about playing. We just want you to get better, and we'll pay you as though you're a playing rookie. Here's, $230,000 to rest and recover. And here's a $20,000 signing bonus to rest and recover. And that next year, the other starting tight end, Dallas Clark, goes down with an injury the week of Sunday night kickoff against the Ravens, and I step up and have a great game, catch a touchdown, third quarter, and the next thing you know, for the next 3 seasons, I'm kind of, that second starting tight end that we used so much in Indianapolis alongside Dallas Clark. And it was just, history. I mean, that was just kind of just an unbelievable way to, that being on that team, winning that Super Bowl never would have happened if it wasn't for going through something that that only the Lord could have used.
Yeah. That's such a great story. There's so much there I want to unpack a little bit, but
Sure.
it's really good. This is the Sports Spectrum podcast, speaking to Ben Utecht, the former NFL tight end. I'm Jason Romano. Ben, I want to ask you, just from that story, first of all, the faith aspect of growing up as the son of PK, I guess, if you will, the Methodist minister, and being a pastor's kid, and how that shaped you to prepare you for some of the obstacles that you just described, and even coming to meet a man like Tony Dungy, who is obviously as outspoken about his faith as anyone, and is a mentor to so many, near and far. So tell us about the faith aspect of your life growing up under your dad and how that shaped you.
Well, it really is everything. You look at, as Scripture calls following Jesus, the way, right? You look at the way, and you look at the blueprint of faith from the Bible, and I think it becomes very clear how powerful designing a belief system and practicing it truly can be. And, I do a lot of speaking on this today for mainstream corporations and how do you build high-performing culture? Well, you follow the blueprint of building a belief system that you can practice. Our Super Bowl ring is the only ring in the history of the NFL to have any spiritual symbolism engraved on it. And the word faith is engraved on the side of the ring. And the acronym that I use to describe what that meant was freedom for all individuals to trust and hope in each other. And when you look at how Jesus built his team of 12, and when you see the blueprint of faith that he created, that was designed by his Father, he took it, he taught it to his 12, and he made them practice it until they became experts of it, and then he left us, right? And he gave us his Holy Spirit, and he said to his disciples, "Now you go and you take this blueprint of faith, this design belief system, and go." And it's the greatest movement the world has ever seen. You can't stop it.
Yeah.
And that is radical, James. That that to me is how powerful faith really is. So what I learned from my dad, what I learned from my mom, by being in an environment of faith where they believed in something bigger than themselves, right? Life was not about Jeff and Laura Utecht. Life was about service to God, striving to take on the character traits of Jesus, and then how do we go out into the world and love God and love people. And that created a foundation that would support me on every single high and every single low that I would face. And because that's always there, because that belief system is concrete, it's objective, and it's real, I could always go back, no matter whatever happened in my life. I'd always go back to that foundation, and it would carry me through, every situation that life can possibly throw at me.
And that's awesome. And then you get to Coach Dungy, who is as outspoken about his faith as any public figure in sports as I've ever seen. You win the Super Bowl and he stands up there and proclaims the name of Jesus in front of 100 million people. And it's just an astounding thing. I've had the pleasure of spending time with Coach Dungy as well, very influential on my life. I just wonder for you, you described that first encounter, but just the integrity of this man and playing for him and what that meant to you, both professionally, obviously, in your career, but even personally and spiritually. Just finding the Lord, finding you and Tony Dungy coming together. Talk about Coach Dungy and what he's meant to you.
Oh, well, he's just, I think, of just a fantastic example of integrity and character. Someone who has a very specific belief and design to how you build a team that's unique, obviously bringing servant leadership to the forefront of leadership styles. And my dad's personality is a lot like Coach Dungy's, where there's that the quiet strength of Coach Dungy off the title of his book, but the reality of just how does that reflect Jesus in him. And I remember multiple times saying that to my dad, like, I just when you watch someone like Tony Dungy make the behavioral decisions that he makes on how he lives his own life, you can't help but kind of see the reflection, back towards Jesus. There's a time for righteous anger, but it's rare. We never really saw it, out of Coach Dungy. Maybe a couple of times in situations over the 4 years I was there, but it was always deserved. But for the most part, always very content in any situation, very under control, always full of wisdom and discernment. And I think those types of traits in a high stress, high intensity environment like the NFL are very powerful, because it calms players down. I don't know if that makes any sense, but when you're around someone like, because you don't have a coach that's all over the place and animated, and he's always able to bring people back down to the fundamentals and techniques of the game, which to me is part of what makes him one of the greatest coaches.
We'll have more of our conversation with Ben Utecht, the former Super Bowl 41 champion NFL tight end, in just a moment. But first, want to tell you about Compassion International. $38 a month, the best money you will spend every single month, one child at a time. Compassion sponsors like you and me are helping over 1.8 million children in 25 countries. Every child, every single child being discipled in the Word of God, over 150,000 children choosing to follow Jesus Christ in the last year alone. And your $38 goes to food, educational training. It just helps them. It gives them a hope. It takes them and releases them from poverty. You can make the difference. It's one person at a time, one child at a time. Go to compassion.com/sportsspectrum and you can make that difference by sponsoring a child today. Compassion.com/sportsspectrum. Sponsor a child today. Now back to our conversation with Ben Utecht, former Super Bowl 41 champion, right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. 2006, you brought it up. I love the idea, first of all, that there is the word faith on the side of that Super Bowl ring. I think that is tremendous. But let's go to that season really quick. It was such a special season for you, obviously, for the team, for the Colts, for the city of Indianapolis, playing tight end, catching passes from Peyton Manning. Take us back to the season, being a part of the Super Bowl winning team. What stands out from that year? Obviously, culture and the way that Coach Dungy led. But what are some... Maybe is there a moment that sticks out from that season that is just that moment for you that just makes you say, yep, that's why we were where we were? Take us back to that season.
Well, it was, there was a lot of anticipation. I mean, the year before, we had that 13-0 run And there was a lot of talk about, is this the next undefeated team?
That's right.
It was just and then unfortunately we had a tragedy in Coach Dungy's family life, and that really, in a very powerful way, brought, I think, the team together, unified us, and we became, I think, fully engaged in a very paternal way. It was a powerful off season and a lot of anticipation coming into that year, and it wasn't as, the thing is it wasn't as successful of a season the year before, even though we had a good season. It wasn't quite as I think perfect up to a point as it was a season before.
Yeah.
But the progress and how we all came together over a period of that time was very, there was something different. And obviously I think it all culminated in probably one of my greatest memories from that whole year is the AFC Championship game against the New England Patriots, where we're literally down 3 touchdowns going into halftime. I mean, the hopelessness that you could see on the players was it was so thick, and then you've got Coach Dungy, who comes into the locker room content in all situations, I'm telling you, and just brings the focus back to what really matters. And he proceeds to tell us what's going to happen on this next kickoff. And you can ask any player from that year to retell the story, and it will be the same. He prophetically begins to name the exact plays that are going to occur from the catch of the kickoff, where he's going to go off on the sidelines. He's going to start on the left hash. And he calls out this drive, James, this offensive drive, and it happens the exact same way that he says it's going to happen.
That's awesome.
I am not making that up. In fact, at our 10-year reunion, Hunter Smith, our punter at the time, gets up in front of the whole team. Jim Irsay, everybody is there, and he's sharing stories, and he tells this story, and he's saying, we just couldn't believe. We're all realizing as this drive is going, that every play that is happening, Coach Dungy just said would happen in the locker room.
Mm-hmm.
And so we marched down just like he said we would, in the way he said we would, and we scored. And it was the greatest AFC Championship comeback in the history of football. And it almost just kind of sealed the belief that it was our time. We were destined. We were destined for
at that point.
year.
I'm winning that game too. You're not losing to the Bears in the Super Bowl, no matter how
exactly
much of a struggle that game was, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's one where if I remember correctly, it was in Miami, that Super Bowl, and it was against the Chicago Bears team that was sort of unknown. Rex Grossman was their quarterback, but it was a closer game than it needed to be. It was rainy. Most games aren't played in the rain on a stage like that, and yet you guys found a way and you won the Super Bowl and beat the Chicago Bears for the Colts, and you got your ring. So, but after that, you win the Super Bowl, and there's the highs of being a part of a championship team. Then soon after, you leave and you go to Cincinnati, and it doesn't quite work out the way that an athlete would have it be planned to be. And you suffered, and I read that you suffered 5 documented concussions. And you and I talked actually about this at the boot camp a few years back, 5 years ago. I've heard the story about that 4th concussion against the Broncos. Can you tell us that story and lead us into what started to take place and transpire to eventually have you make the decision to walk away?
Sure. The Broncos concussion was the first time that I had ever been diagnosed with amnesia. And it was just kind of a strange situation to go through. I remember the day after the game coming in and going to the tight ends meeting room by myself and watching in a dark room the play that the concussion occurred on.
Yeah.
And I'm watching this as though it's a movie that I've never seen before. And I watch myself, get knocked unconscious, and my body goes limp on the turf, and 10, 15 seconds later, I'm slowly up and high-fiving players and talking with players. I sprint off to the sideline, talking to the coaches and the trainers. And I mean, clearly I'm functioning. My cognitive abilities are working. And, they removed me from that game for obvious reasons. But, I don't remember really anything.
Wow.
I mean, there's maybe moments, but I don't really remember anything from that game. And so it's a strange experience to go through, to watch yourself functioning, and yet it's almost as if that never actually happened in your life. And so, that I think for the first time made my wife and I realize that concussions, getting your bell rung, at the time was not. There's a lot more to it, more consequences than I had ever experienced in the past or with any other injury. And so, after the fifth concussion in Cincinnati, and the amount of time it took to kind of get back to feeling normal again, it just was obvious it was time to move on.
Can you describe what it feels like when you suffer a concussion? I know the memory of when it happened, especially that one in Denver, wasn't there, which has to be frightening in its own right. But just, is there a way to describe it? I've never suffered one, but I'm talking about like an NFL concussion. I know a lot of people have suffered concussions in different realms and different sports, but I think there's something different with football when you're talking about banging and hitting and just kind of the mass, the force going up against each other. Can you describe what it feels like when you suffer a concussion?
Sure. Well, every concussion is different. So, a lot of it depends on the hit. I had some concussions that came off of just horribly nasty hits that happened before there was a targeting rule and a head-to-head rule. And, it literally felt like you got hit by a train, and you're when you regain your composure, it's just, it just feels like your head is in a vice, and everything around you is is out of sorts, and so it's I think it's put a spotlight on an injury that so many people in the world actually go through and they face all the time. And it's something that you especially in the game of football, where it's the amount of hits you take over the course of a season that can really have the impact. And so it's definitely an injury that we need to continue to learn more about and take seriously.
You mentioned the word documented concussions. I wonder, just estimated, do you have any idea how many maybe that were undocumented? And do you think that there are many that still go undocumented today? I know that the testing is more stringent. There is, yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, even we alongside the NFL Players Association, I was a part of a educational video that came out about concussions, and it's online and you can go see it. And Aaron Rodgers is quoted in that video just saying that one of the things we need to do is we need to provide more security for our players to be forthcoming and honest about their injury situation. Because he was asked, what's the biggest problem with concussions? And it's basically that players don't feel safe to tell the truth. And so that's just evidence right there that those types of situations are happening all the time. And so, we definitely need to keep trying to create that type of security for players to be to be honest. I've never put a number on it. I think some players they do, and the numbers are always just huge, and I'm wondering how they figured that out. But
Yeah.
for me, it's I can tell you that there's definitely a few moments that I can think of where I'm pretty sure that I had a concussion, and I didn't. I chose not to say something about it because I had already been injured, a number of times already during the season, and there's so much pressure, and it's
Oh yeah.
it's easier to attack these things when you're no longer playing,
Right.
but when because of hindsight. But the reality is when you're when you're there, I don't know if I even today would go back and make a different decision because it's so. I'd like to think that I would, but man, you don't want to let your players down. You don't want to let your coaches down, and it's a difficult thing to face.
Take us to the conversation that you had to have with your wife about stepping away. I know that you said earlier in the very beginning of this interview that you were sort of forced to retire because of the injuries, but you still had to make a decision to walk away. You have to have those conversations, I'm sure, with your wife and how faith played a part in it too. But take us to that conversation and finally saying, I got to stop doing this. I got to step away.
Well, it was a long process, James, to be honest with you. From that, the fourth concussion against the Broncos really started to manifest cognitive consequences that we had never experienced before that made noticeable differences. And so the red flags started going up a little bit even before Cincinnati. And then in Cincinnati and going through that concussion, that was an 8-month process to get back to being cleared to try and play again. And I had gone to the New England Patriots for a workout, still considering, playing. And it was, I think, became pretty clear through that process that the concussion history that I had was pretty significant to teams, and that it was going to be a challenge for me potentially to find a team that would even take on a player that had a history like that, and one that it happened on national TV with HBO Hard Knocks. So it was kind of a high profile concussion case, and so all of these things were kind of leading us to a conclusion over a long period of time, and that so there were a lot of conversations, but at the end of the day, we just had our first of 4 daughters now, and it we felt that it was time to just move on because of family, and I think that and having her support on that was very powerful.
When you retired, I tell people all the time, it's like, when people retire from football or sports, usually, okay, I don't have to get hit anymore. I can actually wake up and, not feel the pain anymore. But for you, it was a little different. You didn't just kind of get better. And then you did. And now that you're being, everything wasn't fine originally for you. And I know that led to writing a song, and then writing a book. And I just really love the idea of the song, and You'll Always Be My Girls, and why you wrote it, and then the reasons why you wrote the book as well, which is called Counting the Days Until My Mind Slips Away, which is, in many ways, the title is heartbreaking just in the way that you're anticipating that this might happen to you.
Sure.
But let's talk about the process of, first of all, writing that song. I remember the video was shown, I think it was shown on Monday Night Football, if I remember, on ESPN when I was still working there, and then the book and writing it and the reasons behind that, especially pertaining to your wife and even more your daughters.
Well, yeah, I kind of got thrust into this world of advocacy, and never really by choice. I mean, who wants to go talk about the injury that wrecked their career?
Right.
But definitely experienced that there's such a huge a huge need when it comes to the brain, for brain disorder, brain disease. I mean, 1 in 5 are affected in this country. That's 60 million people. I mean, it's a lot, and it's unlike any other disease. There's no cures. We're still trying to figure all of that out. And so, when you're diagnosed with a brain disease, it's it, and it's hard on caretakers, because they have to watch this, thing take away the relevance of the person that they have been so closely connected to. So anyway, the choice to write the book and the song was just to be vulnerable, and to talk about fear. And in the process of that, and in the process of writing that song, which came before the book, it was really just kind of a therapeutic process to go through. And at the time, I was still experiencing a lot of cognitive issues, especially connected to memory. And so, and all of this new information was coming out about CTE, and it wasn't good. And I think you can remember just, players' reactions right away. I mean, it was almost automatic that you were going to have it, and so, so you've got all these fears that are happening, and that's really, what I decided to be vulnerable about. And if that was, or is my future, then I need to make sure that I tell the people that I love the most how I feel about them. And that's where the song "You'll Always Be My Girls" came from. And eventually that's where the book came from. And even though there's an ominous title, which is really, to get people's attention. I mean, it's the first line from the song, actually. I'm in here counting the days while my mind is slipping away. And so, but the reality is the book is about perseverance, hope, and love. I mean, it's a book about being vulnerable, about fears, but how it all ties back into living every moment to its fullest. And so,
absolutely,
it's pretty, it was a good process to go through, needless to say.
So obviously you're a husband to Karen. I hear one of your babies in the background. You're a dad to 4 girls, including twins. I can't imagine having 4 girls. I have just one. What's life like now today for you, Ben? Day to day? I know we talked in the beginning about sort of today a little bit, but let's go back to that. And what does that day to day look like? How's your health? How's your mind? How's all that working for you?
I'm so blessed. My wife, Karen, is just a wonderful, woman, and just an incredible mom, and pours into these girls. And so I'm super blessed to have her in my life. Mind is just awesome. I poured into a brain training program a couple years ago, and it saved me. I think it brought me out of this fog that I had been in when I wrote the song, when I wrote the book, and my test results on a highly credible neuropsych evaluation went through the roof. And so it gave me a lot of hope, and really a lot of hope for other players, that you can actually, just like you train your muscles in the gym, you can train your brain. And a lot of those cognitive weaknesses that have come out of potentially multiple hits to the head can be strengthened, and it has totally, I think, brought me to a very good level of health in my life, and then we're just off to the races. I just launched my new consulting firm, Keystone Culture Group, with my partner, Dr. Dan Zismer, and so we're off, working to help companies create high performing culture, and kind of use that championship sports blueprint attached to my partner's academic success, and really bring a powerful product to the industry. So it's an exciting time.
Absolutely. Keystone Culture Group, you said, was the name of the consulting firm. You also are speaking. I've seen you doing a lot of speaking at churches, speaking at conferences and events. And obviously you mentioned songs, or the book, I should say, as being an author, but also songs. You're a musician. Your latest album, Standing Strong, was released earlier this year. I was listening to it yesterday on Spotify. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. So life is good. So let me ask you this from the spiritual perspective. This is the final question. I ask this to all of our guests here as well on the podcast. So for you, Ben, what's the Lord been teaching you now during this season of life, where you are right now, where he has you? What are you learning from God?
Well, in the last 3 weeks, probably the thing that has been at the forefront of my relationship with him is when Jesus told us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think if I've really fallen short in my life, it's been in those areas. And if I'm just being honest, it's coming out of professional sports and having a lot of success, I think over time, has really been a challenge for me, because it fosters arrogance, pride, selfishness, and when I get caught up into those types of emotions and into those types of behaviors, then I do a poor job of loving God and loving people. And Jesus called us to those two things and he said, if you do those two things, it'll take care of the rest. And the reason why is because when you're loving God and when you're loving people unconditionally, there's no room for selfishness, right? Love is the antibody for selfishness. Yep. And so I think what I've really tried to do over the last month in my life is to compete in that area. I want to love God every day. I want to love my neighbor, my wife, my children. I want to love these people better. And we're capable of that. 1 Corinthians 13, we are capable of living out that definition of love, but we have to remind ourselves. We've got to keep it on the forefront of our day. And if we do that, watch the blessings that pour out of that type of relationship.
And we do thank Ben Utecht, Super Bowl 41 champion, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. You can learn more about Ben. His music website is benutechtmusic.com, benutechtmusic.com. His main website is ben-utecht.com, ben-utecht.com. We appreciate Ben's honesty, his vulnerability, and his storytelling in taking us inside the life of an NFL player who didn't have his career go exactly the way he had planned. I don't think that he regrets anything. In fact, he mentioned in the podcast that he wouldn't change anything about his career and the way he went back to playing. But he suffered some concussions, was forced to retire. He's doing well now, but he still has those 5 concussions. He's the author of a book, Counting the Days Until My Mind Slips Away. That's available everywhere, including Amazon, wherever books are sold. And he started a new consulting business. He's speaking. He's doing a lot of great work. You can find him on all the social medias, on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And just give Ben a follow. Let him know that you heard this interview on the podcast, and let him know that that you're wishing him well, as we all are. So we appreciate Ben for joining us here on Sports Spectrum. And we appreciate you. We appreciate our sponsorship with Compassion. Go to compassion.com/Sports Spectrum and sponsor a child through them. And also, we want to invite you to become members of Sports Spectrum and the Sports Spectrum family. Our brand new Sports Spectrum magazine summer issue is out now. It's our first ever all action sports edition. And when I say action sports, we're talking about surfing and snowboarding, wake skating, skateboarding, and more. This is a chance for you to get our magazine. It's a great tool not only to read the stories of sports and faith, but to give it to someone else and encourage them to hear these inspiring stories. So you can become a partner with us. It's just $36. That covers the entire year at Sports Spectrum. And when you become a member, you help fund things like this podcast. You help fund our website content, but you also get 4 issues, our magazines, our quarterly magazine at Sports Spectrum, and our latest issue is our summer issue that's released and available now. You can go to sportspectrum.com, click that Join Now area, and become a member for just $36 a month. Thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast. Tell your friends, take a screenshot of this podcast, share it with them on social media, let them know about Ben Utecht, let them know about all the great things we have going on at Sports Spectrum, and you can email me directly with any questions or any ideas for guests, jason@sportspectrum.com. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time right here on the Sports Spectrum Podcast.